Today we're going to learn one more thing that you can do with participles, and this is a construction that's called the ablative absolute. So obviously we're going to be working with participles in the ablative case. Let's take a look at what they can do. So first of all, what is this thing called the ablative absolute? Well, it is a kind of dependent clause. So just like we have clauses that begin with when or if or since, this is a clause that is like that, but we don't have one of those words that triggers how we're supposed to translate it. It is in the ablative case, so that's the ablative part, and it is grammatically unconnected from the rest of the sentence, and that's why it's called absolute. So you can think of it as having absolutely nothing to do with the main part of the sentence. It's what happens in the ablative absolute is separate. It is usually a noun and a participle, and both the noun and the participle are in the ablative case, and both of them agree in case, number, and gender. And sometimes it can also have a direct object or a prepositional phrase or something like that. Usually what we'll see is a sandwich, so that we would have, for example, maybe our noun in the ablative, and then we would have our participle in the ablative, and then in the middle we might have our prepositional phrase, or we might have a direct object or whatever, but that's going to be in between those two things so that we know that that whole thing goes together. Here are a couple of examples. Bello victo dux castra movit. So you can see that our main sentence, right, is dux castra movit, right? The leader moved the camp. But we have this other thing in the beginning, right? We have bello, which is a noun, and victo, which is a participle. They're both in the ablative singular. And we're going to translate this. You can also see there at the beginning of the sentence, they are set off by a comma. And so they are really separate from the rest of the sentence. So we could say something like, with the war having been won, the leader moved the camp. So you can see war is not a part of the main sentence. Conquering is not a part of the main sentence. That's one separate idea. It's absolute, and it's in the ablative. And we say with the war having been won, and that's perfectly okay. You can always translate your ablative absolutes with this word with, and then noun participle. It will always work. But you can also try to make it into a clause that maybe makes a little more sense. So since the war was won, or after the war had been won, something like that, and then translate your main sentence. You can see the same thing happening in the second sentence. Here's our main sentence, urbem reliquimus. We left the city. And you can see that again, at the beginning, we have a noun in the ablative, here in the ablative plural. We have a present active participle this time. And so we can do, you can see also set off by a comma, right, at the beginning of the sentence. So we could say something like, with the enemy fleeing, we left the city. So you could say, of course, again, when the enemy was fleeing, we left the city. Or you could say, while the enemy was fleeing, we left the city. Because the enemy was fleeing, we left the city. Any of those would be acceptable translations too. But if you're having problems or you just want to make sure that you're doing it right, you can always use this with, and that will always work. Here are a couple of more examples that are slightly maybe more complicated. In the first one, you can see that we have now not just our noun and participle, but we also have this direct object in the middle, in the sandwich. And so that's how we know that all of that goes together. You can see that it's all still at the beginning of the sentence. It's separated off by a comma, and that's going to be a tip that we want to take all of this stuff together, right? All three words. So our main sentence, of course, is still here at the end, and you can see the main sentence is the brother moved to a new land. Right? Frater ad terram nova movit. But we've got this ablative absolute at the beginning with rege, so we can start with our with the king regente ruling, and then what is he ruling? Urbem, ruling the city. The brother moved to a new land. So, and again, you could say since the king was ruling the city, while the king was ruling the city, his brother moved to a new land. Any of those are fine. Again, context will always help you sort of figure out what the best translation is. Our last one is a little stranger maybe than the others. And you can see, again, here's our main. In pace vivimus. We live in peace. And you can see that we have Romulo here, right? But here instead of regente, we have rege. Here we have two nouns, noun, and no participle, which is not the most common kind of ablative absolute, but it is one that we sometimes see, and this is because we have no present active participle for the verb to be. And so if we want to say one thing is another thing, we have to assume the verb to be, as we do in other sentences too, and we have our two nouns. So we could say with Romulus, and then we have to insert being, right, which isn't there, but we understand it because we need it for a sentence to make sense. King, comma, we live in peace. So that we're only going to insert being if we have a noun in our ablative absolute. Otherwise, we're just going to use our participle. So, summing up, the ablative absolute is a construction that appears always in the ablative. It usually has a noun in the ablative and then a participle also in the ablative that agrees with it. It is usually at the beginning of the sentence, and we can often tell because we've got this ablative, and then it's set off by a comma. We can sometimes have a sandwich, but we'll know because we have these two words, the noun and the participle set off by a comma, that all of that is going to go together. It all has to form one idea. There are different ways to translate it. If we use the word with, we will never go wrong, but we can sometimes use words like because or since, when, while, after, although, depending on the context. Sometimes, instead of having a noun plus a participle, we will have two nouns, or sometimes a noun and an adjective. And in that situation, we have to add the participle of the verb to be, being. And that's really it for the ablative absolute. This is the last piece of information we have in this chapter. So don't forget to send me up to 3 questions if you have them. and we will practice next time with the ablative absolute.